In the concrete heart of Harlem, there are laws found in books, and then there are laws forged in the shadows. During the 1,950 seconds, this neighborhood was more than just a place, it was a kingdom. And every kingdom requires a ruler who understands that true power isn't measured by the weight of gold, but by the order of the streets. Bumpy Johnson was that ruler, a strategist who realized that greed, if left to rot, would eventually destroy the very community that sustained his empire. He established a code of conduct, a forbidden rule that served as a line in the sand. To cross it was to invite a consequence that was as final as it was invisible. Imagine you are a dealer walking the corners of Lenox Avenue. You see the money, the fast cars, and the desperate faces of those seeking escape. You might think that in this world of vice, anything goes. But then you notice him, standing in a doorway, blending into the gray brick of the tenements, is a man with a thin frame and an unremarkable face. You would forget his features in an instant if it weren't for his eyes. They are shark-like empty, devoid of anger or joy, reflecting only a cold, mechanical focus. This is Alabama Black, Bumpy's personal shadow, and he is there to ensure that the forbidden rule remains unbroken. Bumpy's rule was clear and uncompromising. You do not poison the future. While the heroin trade was a massive engine of profit, generating sums that would be worth $500,000 in today's currency, Bumpy drew a boundary that no amount of money could buy. There was to be no selling to children, no dealing near the sanctuary of schools, and no cutting the product with lethal toxins that turned neighbors into corpses. To Bumpy, Harlem was a garden that needed to be tended with real food, not a machine to be broken for parts. If you poisoned the soil for an extra dollar, you didn't get a trial, you got the ghost. Many dealers made the fatal mistake of believing the system was too slow to stop them or that they could hide in the chaos of the city. But Alabama Black didn't operate like a policeman. He operated like a surgeon. He would study a target for weeks, learning their favorite diner, the route they took to see their mistress, and the exact moment they felt most secure. He was the silence that preceded a permanent disappearance. In Harlem, crossing the forbidden rule meant you didn't just die, you were erased from the history of the neighborhood as if you had never stood on its pavement. This is the chilling reality of how the King of Harlem maintained his order, and the story of one dealer whose greed led him directly into the hands of a man who felt no remorse. To understand the weight of Bumpy Johnson's rule, you must understand the man who thought he could ignore it. His name was Curtis. Though the streets called him Little Man Johnson, he wasn't a kingpin or a legend. He was a small-time hustler with big-time greed and a short-sighted vision. Curtis believed that in a city as large as New York, a few extra dollars pulled from the pockets of those who shouldn't be buying was just a drop in the ocean. He operated out of a cramped, dimly lit apartment on 129th Street, convinced that behind his double-locked door he was a sovereign power. He was wrong. He didn't realize that in Bumpy's Harlem, your walls have ears and your shadows have eyes. The mistake happened on a Tuesday. It was a cold afternoon, the kind that makes people walk a little faster and keep their heads down. A 15-year-old boy, looking older than his years but still carrying the softness of childhood in his face, approached Curtis. The boy had money, and Curtis had product. In that moment, Curtis didn't see a child whose life was about to be derailed. He saw a transaction. He ignored the age, ignored the trembling hands, and ignored the forbidden rule. He sold the boy a bag of heroin so potent it was meant for seasoned addicts, not a kid looking for a way out of his own head. That night, the boy was found in a stairwell, blue-lipped and barely breathing, his life hanging by a thread in a hospital bed. In the underworld, news of a betrayal travels faster than a bullet. By Wednesday morning, Bumpy Johnson had heard the name. He didn't scream, and he didn't call for a meeting of his lieutenants. He simply looked at the man standing in the corner of his office, the man they called the Ghost. Alabama Black didn't need a lengthy explanation. He only needed a name and an address. For the next 48 hours, Curtis Little Man Johnson lived in a world he didn't realize was closing in on him. He went to his favorite diner, unaware that the man at the end of the counter was timing his exit. He visited his sister, unaware that his every movement was being recorded in a small, leather-bound notebook with clinical, neat handwriting. This is the psychological warfare of the ghost. Black didn't just want to end the problem. He wanted to study the anatomy of the failure. He watched as Curtis laughed with friends, watched as he counted his dirty money, and watched as he eventually returned home to what he thought was safety. Black's methodology was scientific. He understood that human beings are creatures of habit, and habits create vulnerabilities. While Curtis felt secure behind his locks, Black was already inside his routine, waiting for the exact moment when the dealer's guard would drop. This wasn't about hot-blooded revenge. It was about the cold, inevitable restoration of order. On Friday night, the silence in Curtis's apartment was absolute. He had just finished a meal, feeling satisfied with his week's earnings, thinking he had gotten away with it. He hadn't seen a single cop or a single rival. But then, a sound, or rather, the absence of sound. The door didn't crash down. There was no shouting. He simply turned around, and there, standing in the middle of his living room as if he had materialized from the air itself, was James Delroy. The ghost didn't pull a gun. He didn't need one. He just stood there with those empty, shark-like eyes, looking at Curtis not with hatred, but with the flat indifference of a man who was already looking at a ghost. Curtis realized then that his locks, his money, and his arrogance were worthless. He had crossed the line, and in the world of Bumpy Johnson, that was the only mistake you weren't allowed to survive. The atmosphere in that small apartment changed the second Black stepped in. It wasn't just that a predator was in the room, it was the realization that the rules of the world no longer applied to Curtis. In the criminal underworld, there is a specific type of silence that follows a great mistake, a silence that feels like the air being sucked out of a vacuum. Curtis looked at Alabama Black and saw his own death reflected in those empty eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice was a thin, ragged thing. He talked about the money, offered to give it all back, offered to leave Harlem forever. But Black didn't care about the money. Black was a machine built for a single purpose, the maintenance of Bumpy's order. Black looked at Curtis's face, tracing the sweat beads and the frantic twitch of his eyelid. "You look unwell, Curtis," Black said, his voice as flat as a grave marker. "The sweat on your forehead, the way your hands won't stop shaking, those aren't just signs of fear. They are the physical evidence of a soul that has already started to rot from the inside out, just like the boy you sold to. He's in a cold room right now, his heart struggling to beat because of the poison you handed him. You thought you were selling a product, but you were really selling a death sentence to our future." This is the core of Bumpy's philosophy. The external signs of a neighborhood's decay, the addicts, the crime, the broken families, are just the rust in the pipes of the community. In this moment, Black was the antidote to the poison Curtis had released into the streets. "Bumpy has a vision," Black continued, stepping closer. "He sees a Harlem where our children can walk to school without stepping over a needle. He sees a garden where we grow our own power. You are the weed that chokes that garden. You are the clog in the drain that makes the whole system overflow with filth." The logic was cold, surgical, and absolute. There was no room for mercy, because mercy for Curtis meant a death sentence for another child. Black moved then, not with the explosive rage of a street fighter, but with the quiet efficiency of a butcher who had done this 1,000 times. He didn't use a gun. A gun is loud. A gun leaves a shell casing, a signature, a story for the police to tell. Black used a knife, a tool of precision he had mastered in the slaughterhouses of Alabama. He understood that a man's life is held together by small, fragile things, and he knew exactly how to sever them. As the light faded from Curtis's eyes, Black didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel regret. He simply felt the satisfaction of a task completed, a piece of rust removed from the gears of Bumpy's empire. By the time the sun rose over 129th Street, Curtis Littleman Johnson was gone. Not dead in a gutter for the world to see, but erased, his apartment cleaned, his belongings vanished, his existence turned into a ghost story for the other dealers to whisper about. The message was clear. The forbidden rule is the only thing standing between Harlem and the abyss, and the ghost is the one who keeps that line drawn in blood. The disappearance of Curtis Littleman Johnson didn't create a shockwave in the way you'd expect. There were no sirens screaming through the night, no frantic police tape cordoning off the block, and no sensational headlines in the morning papers. Instead, there was something far more devastating, a cold, heavy silence that settled over the apartment on 129th Street. In the world of high-stakes psychology and strategic control, we call this a content gap. When a person vanishes without a single trace, it triggers the most primitive fear in the human mind. People aren't afraid of what they see, they are terrified of what they are forced to imagine in the dark. In the hidden corners of the bars and barbershops along Lenox Avenue, the dealers began to whisper. They looked at Curtis's empty apartment, a space that had been professionally, almost surgically, cleared in a single night. From the cheap suits Curtis used to brag about to the stacks of dirty cash he kept under his floorboards, everything was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood on the wood, no overturned furniture. This absolute cleanliness was the unmistakable signature of Alabama Black. Those who understood the unspoken laws of Harlem knew that Curtis hadn't just been killed. He had been erased from reality for daring to touch the forbidden rule. While the streets were thick with rumors and paranoia, Bumpy Johnson remained the image of a perfect gentleman. He appeared at his favorite restaurant, calmly cutting into a medium-rare steak, nodding to his neighbors with a steady, peaceful smile. But that very calm was a message more lethal than any shouted threat. It told all of Harlem that order had been restored, the poison had been removed, and the community's life would continue according to the king's law. Bumpy understood that true authority isn't built on loud displays of force. It is built on the quiet, inevitable consequence. He didn't need to explain what happened to Curtis because the empty apartment said everything. The fear in the neighborhood began to shift. It moved from simple anxiety to a state of total submission. Dealers who once thought only of profit now felt a change in the air every time they stepped onto the pavement. Now, when they saw a child near their operation, they no longer saw a customer or an easy mark. Instead, they saw the shadow of the ghost watching from the gaps between the tenements. They felt those empty, shark-like eyes recording their every move. The disappearance of Curtis became a living lesson in the cost of betrayal. In Bumpy's world, silence was the ultimate weapon, a reminder that the line in the sand was drawn in blood, and the man who kept that line was someone you would never see coming until it was already too late. The ripples from the disappearance of lawbreakers in Harlem did not stop at the borders of Lenox Avenue. They traveled like a cold front down to Little Italy, seeping into the back rooms where the Italian Mafia Commission ran the city of New York. Bosses like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello didn't care about morality, but they cared deeply about efficiency and security. In the underworld, a reckless dealer is a liability to the entire system. They attract the heat of the FBI and the unwanted eyes of the precinct. When Bumpy Johnson enforced his forbidden rule, he wasn't just protecting the children of Harlem. He was building a strategic buffer zone that even the mafia families envied. Imagine a sit-down in a dimly lit Manhattan steakhouse. The air is thick with expensive cigar smoke and the unspoken tension of powerful men. Lucky Luciano looks Bumpy in the eye and asks about the ghost, Alabama Black. Luciano had heard the stories how one man made 8 of Dutch Schultz's executioners vanish in a single week. But what truly impressed Luciano wasn't the violence. It was the discipline. Bumpy sat there, calm as a judge, and explained his philosophy. In Harlem, we don't sell out the future for a quick buck. If you want a long-term business, you need customers who stay alive and a community that doesn't revolt. This was the moment the forbidden rule transformed from a moral choice into an invaluable strategic asset. The commission realized that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another street-level gangster. He was a master of risk management. By eliminating the rust in the system, greedy and careless dealers like Curtis Bumpy prevented the kind of chaos that causes federal crackdowns. The Italian mobs respected Bumpy because he possessed the one thing they craved most, absolute order. And standing behind that order was Alabama Black, a man Frank Costello famously described as a machine without a heart. Black's presence at these negotiations required no words. His empty eyes were a constant reminder that any betrayal of Bumpy's agreements would lead to a conclusion with no possibility of appeal. Why did the most powerful wolves in the criminal world agree to share the throne with a black man from Harlem? Because Bumpy proved that real power isn't about how many guns you have, but how much chaos you can control. The Forbidden Rule turned Harlem into a fortress that was nearly impossible for the police to penetrate through traditional means, because the community, while they feared Bumpy, respected him for keeping their families safe. This was a sophisticated psychological lever. Bumpy made himself the enforcer of justice where the legal system had failed, and the Mafia understood that a partner who keeps his home turf clean is worth more than a warehouse full of gold. While the underworld bowed to the Forbidden Rule, the upper world, the precinct captains and federal agents, were hitting a wall of silence that felt like trying to punch smoke. By the mid-1950 seconds, the FBI had folders thick with unsolved homicides linked to Bumpy Johnson's territory. They knew the names of the dead dealers who had vanished. They knew the patterns. But they had a problem that no amount of surveillance could solve. They were hunting a ghost. James Alabama Black Delroy was the ultimate anomaly in their files. Most hitmen were loud, bragged in bars, or left a trail of witnesses and shell casings. But Black left nothing. No fingerprints, no witnesses, and most importantly, no one who was willing to speak his name out loud. Think about the psychological toll this took on the investigators. Imagine being a detective who knows exactly who the monster is, but every time you bring a witness into the interrogation room, they turn pale at the mere mention of a thin man with empty eyes. Bumpy Johnson had created a wall of loyalty that was reinforced by the ghost's effectiveness. In the strategic framework of power, this is called total immunity through fear. Bumpy didn't have to pay off every cop. He only had to ensure that the consequences of talking were far more terrifying than the consequences of staying silent. Alabama Black wasn't just an enforcer. He was a psychological barrier that kept the law at a distance. The FBI began to realize that Black's loyalty wasn't built on money or greed. They tried to find a hook, a gambling debt, a woman, a family member they could use as leverage. They found nothing. Black lived like a monk of the underworld. He had no hobbies, no vices, and no connections to anyone but Bumpy. This made him untouchable. You cannot flip a man who wants nothing. You cannot threaten a man who has already spent years in a psychiatric ward and feels no fear. This is the Arctic cold I mentioned before, a state of being where the typical human two-weight or emotional pressure points simply do not exist. One federal agent, in a memo that was discovered years later, described the frustration of watching Bumpy and Black from a distance. He wrote, "It's as if they are operating in a different dimension. Johnson provides the logic, and the other one, the quiet one, provides the finality. They don't just break the law, they replace it with their own. This is the essence of strategic violence. It's not about chaos, it's about establishing a rival system of justice. Every time a dealer vanished for breaking the Forbidden Rule, the neighborhood didn't call the police. They looked at the empty space where the dealer used to be and understood that the shadow law was the only one that mattered. This period marked the peak of Bumpy's reign. He had successfully balanced the greed of the mafia, the needs of the community, and the lethality of his enforcer. But as we know, every empire that is built on silence eventually faces the noise of a changing world. The late 52nds brought new pressures, tougher federal laws, and a new generation of criminals who didn't respect the old ways. But for now, the wall held. The ghost remained in the shadows, his notebook filling with names, his knife staying sharp, and the Forbidden Rule remaining the most dangerous line in New York City. Greed in Harlem was like a virus. Once you suppressed it in one place, it mutated and found another way to spread. After the disappearance of Curtis Littleman Johnson, the streets learned that direct violation of the Forbidden Rule was a suicide mission. But for some, the lure of easy money was too strong to abandon it, just needed to be smarter. A new breed of dealers emerged, men who believed they could find loopholes in Bumpy's law. They didn't sell to children directly anymore. Instead, they built shadow networks. They used older addicts as proxies, created complex drop-off points, and communicated in codes that even the police couldn't crack. They thought they had outsmarted the ghost. They thought that by adding layers of distance, they could stay out of the red circle in Alabama Black's notebook. They were wrong. One such man was known as Slim Richards. Slim was a tactician of the gutter, a man who prided himself on never touching the product and never meeting the customer. He operated like a ghost of his own, using a chain of young lookouts not to buy, but to watch for the police. Slim believed that if Bumpy couldn't link him to a specific sale, Bumpy couldn't touch him. But Bumpy Johnson didn't need a court of law to reach a verdict. He understood that strategic violence isn't about proving a crime, it's about identifying a disruption in the order. Bumpy saw the rust returning to the pipes, and he gave Black the order to dismantle the mechanism. This is where the true terror of Alabama Black's methodology revealed itself. Black didn't go after the proxies or the lookouts. He didn't waste his time on the fingers of the network. He went for the brain. For 3 weeks, Black became a part of the architecture of Slim's life. He didn't just watch Slim. He learned the anatomy of his patterns. He recorded the precise minute Slim took his coffee, the specific brand of cigarettes he bought, and the nervous tic Slim developed whenever a black sedan drove past. In the strategic framework of power, this is called total behavioral mapping. Before Black ever pulled a knife, he had already captured Slim's soul on the pages of his leather-bound journal. The psychological pressure began to mount before Slim even realized he was a target. Things began to change in his environment, small, subtle shifts that only a paranoid mind would notice. A chair in his stash house moved 3 inches to the left, a cigarette butt left on his windowsill when he knew he hadn't smoked there, a copy of a newspaper left on his doorstep with a circle around a story about a sharecropper from Alabama. Slim started to feel the weight of those shark-like eyes before he ever saw them. He began to realize that distance doesn't protect you from a man who moves like smoke. The shadow network was being mapped, and the ghost was closing the distance, 1 page at a time. The end for Slim Richards was a masterclass in strategic silence. He had spent months building walls, only to find that the ghost was already inside them. When the final consequence arrived, it wasn't a battle. It was a clinical removal. Slim had tried to use complexity as a shield, but Black used that same complexity as a roadmap to his destruction. As the shadow networks collapsed and the dealers responsible began to vanish one by one, Harlem received a new lesson. You can change the method, you can hide behind proxies, and you can encrypt your business, but you can never outrun a man who understands that every pattern has a flaw, and every flaw has a consequence. The tragedy of those who crossed Bumpy Johnson was that they never realized they were already dead until the moment they stopped breathing. In the strategic landscape of the streets, there is a threshold known as the point of no return. For a dealer who dared to circumvent the forbidden rule, that point wasn't reached when they were caught. It was reached the very second they conceived the plan to cheat the neighborhood. By the time Alabama Black began his hunt, the verdict had already been rendered. There was no defense, no mitigation, and no appeal. The ghost was simply the courier of an inevitable fate. The ghost's approach during this phase was a masterclass in psychological erosion. He would often appear to his targets not when they were alone in a dark alley, but when they were surrounded by their peers, standing just at the edge of the light. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't shout, and wouldn't even move. This strategic presence was designed to break the target's mind before the steel ever touched their skin. When you know you are being hunted by something that cannot be bribed, cannot be reasoned with, and cannot be stopped, the air itself begins to feel like lead. Dealers began to collapse under the weight of their own paranoia, making frantic, desperate mistakes that led them directly to the ghost's door. This phase was also about the preservation of Bumpy's political capital. Bumpy knew that if he allowed even one exception to the forbidden rule, even for his oldest friends or most loyal soldiers, the entire moral architecture of his kingdom would crumble. The ghost was the tool that ensured the rule remained sacred. In the eyes of the ghost, a dealer who poisoned a child was no longer a man. They were a defect in the machinery of Harlem. When a dealer vanished, the void they left behind served as a monument to Bumpy's unwavering resolve. It sent a message to the Italian families, to the federal agents, and to every hustler on the corner. Harlem belongs to those who protect its future, and those who dare to threaten it will find that the shadows have teeth. The forbidden rule was not just a law, it was the soul of the community. And as the ghost moved through the list of names in his leather-bound journal, he wasn't just committing acts of violence, he was performing a ritual of purification. He was the cold, mechanical force that ensured the Garden of Harlem remained free of the weeds that sought to choke its growth. This was the final realization for many, that in the kingdom of Bumpy Johnson, the only thing more dangerous than the police or the mafia was the silent judgment of a man who felt no remorse and forgot no crimes. By the early 1960 seconds, the world outside Harlem was changing. The noise of the civil rights movement began to drown out the silent deals made in the back rooms. A new generation was rising, one that traded in protest and politics rather than the old-world structures of street empires. But inside the heart of the neighborhood, the forbidden rule remained the bedrock of existence. Bumpy Johnson was an aging king, his hair graying and his pace slowing, but his authority was as sharp as the edge of a razor. Why? Because the ghost was still there. Alabama Black had become more than just a man. He had evolved into an urban myth, a silent guardian of the code who didn't seem to age with the rest of the world. This is the psychological brilliance of Bumpy's long-term strategy. He understood that a leader's greatest weapon isn't his presence, but his legacy. He had trained the neighborhood to police itself through the mere possibility of the ghost's intervention. In the strategic framework of power, this is known as residual deterrence. You don't need to commit violence every day if everyone remembers the last time you did. The empty apartment of Curtis Littleman Johnson and the Vanish network of Slim Richards served as permanent reminders. The forbidden rule was no longer a threat. It was a part of Harlem's DNA. But for Bumpy and Black, the air was getting thinner. The FBI was no longer just watching. They were dismantling the very foundations of the city's underworld. Bumpy knew that the end was coming, not through a bullet, but through the slow, grinding gears of the federal system. Yet, he never wavered on the rule. Even as his lieutenants were picked up and his territory was squeezed, Bumpy ensured that the garden remained protected. He knew that if he let the poison in now, everything he had built for 30 years, every sacrifice made by the ghost, would be for nothing. The relationship between the king and the ghost reached its final, silent understanding during these years. They didn't need to discuss the risks. They shared a whiskey in the quiet of Bumpy's apartment, the leather-bound notebook sitting on the table between them, a catalog of 3 decades of order. Black's shark-like eyes remained empty, but there was a profound weight in his stillness. He was the anchor of Bumpy's soul, the one person who understood that their lives weren't about greed, but about the structure that kept a community from eating itself alive. They were the architects of a secret justice, and as the tides of power shifted, they prepared for the final chapter of their legend, knowing that while they might fade, the line they drew in the blood would never be erased. In July 1968, the heart of Harlem stopped. Bumpy Johnson, the strategist who had ruled the streets for over 30 years, suffered a fatal heart attack while eating at Wells' restaurant. He was 62 years old. With his passing, the sun set on an era of calculated order and strategic violence. But the most chilling part of the story wasn't Bumpy's death. It was what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. James Alabama Black Delroy, the man who had been Bumpy's shadow, his weapon, and his most loyal enforcer, simply ceased to exist. He didn't show up at the funeral. He didn't try to take over the organization. He didn't sell his story to the papers. He did exactly what he told Bumpy he would do. He faded away. Without Bumpy to provide the structure, the machine simply stopped. Alabama Black was a man who didn't understand human connection, but he understood purpose. When the source of that purpose died, the ghost returned to the ether. Some say he went back to the rural South, living out his days as a quiet janitor who never spoke a word. Others believe he met a violent end at the hands of those who had waited decades for Bumpy to fall. But in the world of legends, the truth is often less important than the impact. Black left behind no body, no fingerprints, and no record, only a void where a monster used to be. But the forbidden rule did not die with them. For years after Bumpy was gone, the dealers in Harlem still felt the chill of those shark-like eyes. The legend of the ghost who erased men for poisoning children became the neighborhood's silent guardian. Even as the heroin epidemic worsened in the 70 seconds and 80 seconds, the stories of Curtis Littleman Johnson and Slim Richards were passed down as warnings. Bumpy Johnson and Alabama Black proved a fundamental truth of power. Strategic violence is not about the number of lives taken, it is about the sanctity of the boundaries you draw. They showed that when the legal system fails to protect a community, a shadow law will rise to fill the vacuum. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense, but they were the architects of a secret justice. They lived in the gray space between morality and survival, using the only tools they had: intelligence, patience, and final consequences to protect the future of their streets. As you walk through Harlem today, you might not see the ghosts of the 1,950 seconds, but if you listen closely to the silence between the city's noise, you can still hear the echo of the code. The king is gone, and the ghost has vanished. But the line they drew in the blood remains a testament to the power of loyalty and the heavy cost of a rule that was never meant to be broken.